Croeso I Gŵyl Haf. Welcome to Gŵyl Haf 2021. We're back for a second year, and it's a bit surreal. And when I sort of decorated the dome this morning, it felt just so nice. So nice to be back, and I'm really excited for this year's programming. So there are 44 events that we've pre-recorded over the last month or so. There are 4 events per day. So the first event starts with a lunchtime talk from a publisher, a blog, or a poetry reading. Then at 2 p.m, so that goes up at 12 p.m. Then at 2 p.m. we have a children's talk, children's and students, and they sort of do vary in ages of who they're targeted at, but are incredibly watchable for any age and sort of whatever age student you happen to be. Then we also have an early evening talk and a late evening talk, which are our talks with translators, authors and academics, covering a wide range of topics. In particular, we want to draw attention to our Creole series and to our BSL sign language series. Those are some of our favourite talks from the festival. Obviously I'll say all of them are my favourites, but each one has something unique, and those ones are well worth your time if you're only going to make time for a few talks. So yeah, I want to sort of show some of our printed material. The sign of a legit literary festival, after all, is having printed material. This is our programme, with Eleanor Cowell's gorgeous illustration on the front cover, and the rest of the design work by me. We also have postcards available if anybody should want to send a postcard, and limited edition prints of Eleanor Cowell's lovely design as well, and our poster for this year if anybody wants to get a hold of those. So yeah. So we have talks from all over the world this year. We have talks from Zimbabwe, from India and Brazil, to just sort of name a few. And in particular today we have 4 talks for you. The first was Sinarist Books, who are a Chinese fiction publisher, and I interviewed Daniel Lee, who and we sort of talked about marketing books, about Chinese fiction and translation more generally, and then also a little bit about paper cutting. He designed his own book cover, and just sort of more generally whatever took our fancy, really. Then Rebecca Duvald, who was very generous to take her time since she was getting married 2 days after we recorded our talk. Congratulations, Rebecca. So we covered a little bit about what you need to know if you want to be a translator, and like how to make that your career, and also the financial sort of implications of that, and like sort of the financial questions. So basically, if you have any questions at all about whether you might want to be a translator, that's the talk for you. Then motorbike. Then we have our 2 evening talks. The first of which I think is possibly the most important talk I've ever organised, just for the fact of its sort of invisibility in culture, and what I learnt from it and what I think you can learn from it too. So the talk is with a professor called Rachel Sutton Spence, and is interpreted by an interpreter called Lisa Lloyd Flach, and it's a talk about sign language, literature and poetry. And so Rachel talks us through what sign language, literature and poetry is, and then why as a visual language it is able to do so many interesting things that a written or spoken language cannot do. In particular, if you are a hearing person, I think it's really important important isn't the right word. I think if you're a hearing person or a deaf person, I think you will enjoy this talk, and I think that for people who have maybe never considered the possibilities of a visual language, I think you'll really enjoy it. I certainly did. There was so much to be learnt from it, and it was just also, both Rachel and Lisa are just lovely and amazing, so I'd highly recommend that one. And then we have our evening talk today, which is on the adventures of China Iron. So this book is a LGBTQ plus feminist post-colonial retelling of the Argentinian epic poem Martin Fierro, and the author Gabriela Cabezon Camara, she's just created this wonderful work based on a throwaway line in Martin Fierro. There was one line where he leaves his wife, or woman, I think it might be woman, behind, and she's taken that line and run with it and created this whole queering of that original text. And both Fiona and Iona, so the translators are Fiona McIntosh and Fiona McIntyre from the University of Edinburgh, and they are fantastic, and they have gone above and beyond for this text. They have their insight and their thoughtfulness with this text, their thoughtfulness with their approach to translation generally is remarkable, and they are both two such lovely people, and the talk is a real gem, and a really important talk and a joyful book. I would highly recommend so much. So those are our 4 talks for today. Sunarist Books, Rebecca Duvall, Rachel Sutton Spence and Lisa Boyd Flack are talking about signing about sign language, literature and poetry, and then also Fiona McIntosh, Fiona McIntyre with The Adventures of China Iron by Charco Press, published by Charco Press. Without further ado, here are some highlights from those talks to give you a flavour of them.
So This is Sunflower Fields is about the author. It's a kind of literary memoir, and it's about an author and her family, extended family, trying to kind of eke out this existence in this barren land in kind of northwest China, an area called Xinjiang, but not traditionally where you have Xinjiang, where the Uyghurs are. It's kind of a bit more north than that. It's kind of on the Russian and kind of Kazakh and kind of in the Mongolian border, right at that region. Not in Mongolia, outer Mongolia border, or Mongolia border. And primarily there are Kazakh people living there, and they're kind of a little bit more nomadic by nature, and they're coming into this land and trying to raise sunflowers. And it's this beautiful story of kind of this small story of kind of interaction between kind of her and her family and her mother, grandmother, her dogs and stuff like that. And it's just kind of filled with these really beautiful kind of small observations on life, and it's a beautiful picture. And I don't have it. I only have the Galley edition here, but you kind of get a hint of it through the kind of these images, these beautiful images that I think you have the colored edition, don't you?
Yes. Would you like me to?
Yes, please.
The ones at the back.
Yes, please. Yes, you kind of see all of this kind of really happened. It really went through the author, and she really did live in that situation, and kind of that kind of situation for that time. And really, she's one of those authors that kind of fought her way up outside of the mainstream of Chinese publishing, because she covers an area which is like not few authors generally go to, and she's outside of these kind of Eastern city kind of not exactly cliques, but kind of like literary circles that like generally write about Han things, basically. And she fought her way up and really kind of achieved a kind of a renown outside of that, which is, and especially as a woman writer, a female writer in China, and as writing about her subject matter, that's no mean feat, really. So I really enjoyed working. We held a couple of events with her. She is the most endearing person in the world. I think you can tell. Links in the description below. And she, like, you can tell why audiences really fall in love with her, really, and her writing, because she's not very good at maybe public speaking and stuff like that, but you can tell like a lot of careful work has went into like rendering what's on the page. So yeah, it was a really good project to work on. For the cover, we actually there's a linked somewhere on our, yeah.
This is like my favorite cover design behind the scenes ever.
We essentially managed, I got obsessed with paper cutting for a bit. And I was like, oh, perfect, a sunflower cover, yes. So I conscripted my girlfriend into it as well. And we spent like a week basically cutting out this and like adjusting it different ways. And eventually we arrived at that cover. It's one of the things I was like, oh, that was a dream project to work on, definitely.
I think it really depends on what fascinates you about languages. I think we've got a bit of an idea maybe that translators are all these like bookish people who just like always sit down in their little rooms and they just want to be alone with their books. And that might be you, and that's great. In which case, like, pick up a book. Maybe if you've not read that many books in the foreign language, you can pick up your favorite book in English, see if it's been translated into that language or if it's been translated from that language, and try and read them in parallel, and then kind of compare and contrast, write down the words and like those kind of things. So this is more about the sort of practical things, but also, I mean, teachers would have probably talked about this as well, but I feel like that's related to finding what interests you about the language that'll necessarily make you interested in pursuing that some more. So if you're a bookish person and you really, really want to read a book, then it's really easy for you to like pick up a book and read it. If you love films and TV programs, then like, I mean, now I think it's like Walter Presents or something has like lots of free TV in like lots of different languages. And so often it's subtitles. You can have your subtitles on, you can listen to it as well. Which is also kind of relates again to the specialism of like, you know, what do you think, what would you like to do with the languages sort of later on. But also in terms of like, if you, I guess maybe it's nice to at this point talk about the difference between translation and interpreting, because if you feel like I'd really like to learn a language because I really want to travel and I really want to go out and I really want to meet people, maybe you want to think about becoming an interpreter. So the difference between translation and interpreting, generally speaking, is that the translating is when you write it down, when you produce a text at the end, but interpreting is the spoken thing between two. So there's different ways of interpreting. There's sort of interpreting, you know, where you talk at the same time. You see, sometimes see pictures of people in booths with their little headphones on, while there's a conference going on and they hear the sort of like French coming in and they speak in English and it kind of gets recorded and people know. Or there's a sort of consecutive interpreting where you take notes while somebody speaks and then you give a sort of lecture afterwards. So those are kind of like other aspects of using your languages as well. So depending on what you want to get into, you obviously would be seeking like different ways of getting into it. In terms of, for example, literary translation, a really good starting point is a Google group called the Emerging Translators Network. It's full of a lot of translators who like, they're either already translators, but maybe they translate, you know, legal translation, they translate finance translations, they translate marketing, but they want to become literary translators. Or there's a couple of people who have studied languages, are still studying languages, and maybe are thinking maybe literary translation would be a good thing to go into. And it's just like, it's a thread of like people, like-minded people, effectively, some with more experience, some with less experience. And you can browse you can just join it if you have an inkling to become a literary translator, and you can browse the sort of database that exists now because there's so much information out there. Or you can also, if none of your questions are answered there, you can ask a question as well, and people will definitely respond and definitely be helpful. Because I think that's one of the key things maybe in terms of the translation community, is that like people are really friendly and really open. So I've only encountered nice and helpful people when I've asked any questions or any help or any advice. They've always been really friendly and helpful. So don't be shy and ask. And maybe even some teachers might also know translators who, you know, if you've got specific questions about translation, to get in touch with as well. But definitely don't be afraid to ask. No question is a stupid question.
Maybe is a
characteristics. Oh, that's a good word. The characteristics of sign language. I could make that the lecture heading, couldn't I? So yeah, so sign language literature, I think we need to understand that sign languages will have their own literatures. It's like English literature or French literature or German literature, or whatever. But if we take, say, Libras literature, the Brazilian sign language literature, what we're saying is that it is the literature of the Brazilian deaf community. And we usually say that there are 4 key characteristics of sign language literature. So the first one is that it's the literature by deaf people. So deaf people produce this literature. It is their language art form, and they're hearing people, so people who aren't part of the deaf community, hearing people who know sign language and who know it well, and who know deaf people well and understand deaf people's experiences, that kind of thing, they could produce it, just like there are some people who aren't native English speakers who do produce English literature. But mostly, I think we're safe to say that sign language literature is something that is produced by deaf people. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that a lot of the time the content is about the experience or the knowledge that deaf people have of the world, of life. It shows the deaf view of the world, if you like. Now, that could be my experience as a deaf person makes me see the world like this, or it could be a specific thing that is related to deafness. But I'm going to show you some examples later, and some of them do talk directly about deafness, and some of them don't. Some of them are just, this is life. So that's the second one. So it's produced by deaf people. It usually talks about the experience, or in some way it shows the experience of deaf people, whether it talks directly about the deaf experience or whether it's just, this is my view of the world as a deaf person. The third thing is that it is principally directed at deaf people. So you expect your audience to be deaf, and that's not to exclude hearing people. And in fact, there are plenty of examples of videos, for example, on the internet where there are deaf stories that are translated. They have subtitles or may even have a voiceover, because, you know, hearing people or people who don't sign, they're invited to take part too. But the primary audience, the people that deaf literature is really aimed at, is deaf people. And the last one is that deaf literature is in sign language. That's the point of sign language literature. Now, obviously, you can't have sign language literature without having a community of signers. So the idea of deaf literature and sign language are very closely related. And some deaf people have written books about the deaf experience in English, say. And there is some debate as to whether we want to call that deaf literature or not. It may well be, but it's certainly not sign language literature. The point of sign language literature is that it's produced by deaf people, it talks about deaf people's experience, it's aimed at deaf people, and it's in sign language. So that's kind of a summary. Those are my characteristics of sign language literature, I would say.
We're told that China is a word that's derived from Quechua, and it's just a generic blanket word for woman. That's all it is. So this novel does quite a lot in terms of actually creating a whole story and protagonism for La China. So Gabby's operating in a kind of wider tradition as well, which is the gauchesque, which is a body of work from Argentina, sometimes Uruguay, about gauchos and working on the land and living off the land and cattle raising and traveling and kind of living on your wits and kind of pitted against circumstance and nature. Anyway, that is the kind of the baggage, and the baggage would be completely digestible and understood by Argentinians on the whole. Either they might have studied Martin Fierro as a kind of set texty kind of thing at school or at uni, or just sort of absorbed the idea of the character and the narrative through kind of wider national culture. So that's fine for them, that's fine for Gabriela. But for us as the translators, naturally, we had to do something there, because our sort of notional reader couldn't be expected to deal with that and cope with all that. And we somehow had to sort of present that and provide the sort of necessary support to be able to enjoy this novel, which in itself is just a brilliant adventure story. and doesn't need any kind of apparatus. And we certainly didn't want readers to feel that they needed to kind of go out and buy some sort of study guide or like cliff notes or anything like that. So that was what we hoped to do, that we could create this same adventure story without kind of being worthy and educational and providing kind of synopsis of the national literature of Argentina.
The translator's note at the end kind of allows us to have a sort of halfway house on that one, because for those who want to follow up those things a bit more, they can do in the translator's note, but that's at the end, and so you do read the novel on its own terms before you get to that.
It's all different now as well. I guess we've also learned a bit about how readers operate at the moment, and so people do actually quite comfortably look up Martin Fierro on their phone kind of very quickly. It's not really actually a huge laborious research project just to do that. So that's been really interesting as well.
This is so interesting. I didn't realize this at all. So is there any added gloss? So gloss is sort of what translators might say, where you have to explain something in a translation that wasn't in an original, or you might have to sort of like something that's implied, explain it a little bit. Was there added gloss in this book? Because if there was, I certainly didn't pick up on anything being jarring. Or did you just sort of slightly, say, well, they won't have this context, but that's okay?
I think certainly in our early drafts we did, and then we kind of pared it back. We were constantly asking one another, how much do we need to explain this without wanting to actually enter into explanation? How much do we want to kind of help the reader? And I think what we put in initially was gradually reduced. So there may be a few hints. I think we maybe added in the word president somewhere, did we, Iona? Mm-hmm. Help me here.
That's a really good example. That's a good concrete example. And maybe I think perhaps there's still a little bit of gloss around family relationships, or where people are, or where people have gone, what happened, but minimal in the end, thankfully.
Thank you so much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed those highlights, and go check out any of the full talks that catch your interest. I'm so excited to start the festival and to open it up like this, and I really hope to see you tomorrow for day 2. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.